So welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. It's my great pleasure today to introduce a dear friend of mine, Fritjof Capra. So it's really apt that we're inviting you here with these young women from the Permayouth, Maya, my daughter, and Eve, to really talk about some of the questions that will help them to make sense of what's going on and to share the insights that you have from a systems perspective. And we're going to be talking a little bit later on as we move forward about your book, The Systems, I don't know if we can see that, The Systems View of Life. And so we're working with Maya and the Permayouth too to find a way to access that material for them and to really uncover a sense of eco-literacy and eco-design and a deeper understanding of the world. Both of these girls are homeschooled and have brilliant minds. And so it's really wonderful to be able to join you together. A typical thing that we do in Australia is a welcome to country. It's a acknowledgement of Indigenous communities. So Maya is going to do that.
So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we respectively meet and belong to. And for me, it's the Gubbi Gubbi land, which was never ceded. And I also pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So.
Yeah, thanks, Maya.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to join you in this experiment, I should say, because I've never had a sustained conversation with young people, and I'm very happy to do it with you, Morag. You are by far my most brilliant student.
Wow,
So I'm very happy to, pass that on to the next generation with your help, and really look forward to this conversation.
It's a pleasure to meet you. And the first question I have to ask you is, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, pleasure to meet you, Eve, and Maya too. Well, I am a scientist and writer. And I'm also an environmental educator and activist. And I didn't start out like this, obviously. I started out as a physicist. I was trained in physics, got my Ph.D. in Austria. I'm Austrian. So at the University of Vienna, I got my Ph.D. in the 1960s. At the same time, I became interested in Eastern philosophy, in the spiritual traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. And almost immediately, I saw significant parallels between the worldview presented by these Eastern spiritual teachers and the worldview that emerged in modern physics. And so 10 years later, I published a book called The Tao of Physics, and I got a copy here. So you can see it has a meditating Buddha, and then it has these tracks of subatomic particles from physics laboratories. And so I explored the parallels between, modern physics and Eastern mysticism. And this book was tremendously successful. More successful than I had ever dreamed or imagined. And so as a consequence, I was invited to give lectures and seminars to all kinds of audiences, beginning in London, where I lived at the time, and then all over the world. And I talked to professionals of all walks of life. And many of them told me that this change of paradigms, as it was called, from a mechanistic view to a holistic and what I called an ecological view, was not only happening in physics, but in many other fields. And so I explored these other fields and spent the next 30 years designing a grand synthesis of this new paradigm, which I call the systems view of life. And that's the title of my latest book, which is a textbook published by Cambridge University Press, and it's called The Systems View of Life. So that's briefly what I have been doing. I have been teaching this Systems View of Life at Schumacher College. I now teach it in an online course called Capra course, which I've, held for 4 years now, and I have a network of alumni around the world of 1,500 or more. And so my activity is, writing, researching, teaching, and, helping to, create a better world, a more sustainable future. So that's what I do.
And thanks for doing that, because that's inspired. I mean, it's certainly inspired our family, and I know so many, and it inspired permaculture. The underpinning work that you've done is very much the foundation of the thinking and the philosophy behind things like permaculture. I see them as an applied systems thinking.
And that's really an Australian connection, right? Because
yes,
permaculture started in
right.
Australia, right?
Yeah. So how would you describe the new paradigm, and how would you suggest that we transition to that?
Well, that's really two questions. So let's split that into two questions, okay? And I'll talk about the first. This change from a mechanistic worldview to a holistic or systemic view, to sum it up in a nutshell, in a single sentence, it's really a change, a very fundamental change of metaphors, from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. We have learned in quantum physics that the material world at the very small level of atoms and subatomic particles is not a world of separate objects, but rather a world of patterns of relationships, a network of relationships. And that's true not only for atomic physics, but it's true for life in general. Ecologists speak of food webs, which are networks of feeding relationships. And then biologists say that, tell us that a cell is a network of molecules, a network of chemical processes. So one of the most important discoveries of 20th century science has been that the network is the basic pattern of organization of all living systems. So this is essentially what the new paradigm is, to think about the world in terms of networks. And let me just mention one consequence, which is maybe the most important consequence of this shift from the machine to the network. And that is when you think of the major problems of our time, energy, environment, economic inequality, violence and war, the climate emergency, now the COVID pandemic, what you realize very soon is that none of these problems can be solved in isolation. They're all interconnected and interdependent. In fact, Eve mentioned that in one of the introduction to one of the questions she sent in. So these are systemic problems, interconnected and interdependent.
How would you suggest we transition?
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to educate ourselves. And, there are many ways we can transition, and we have to transition. But if you ask me, the answer will always be education. And in order to transition, there's even an organization called Transition Network, which you may know, started with the Transition Town movement and then morphed into Transition Network. There's also a field of design, a new field called transition design. And there are literally hundreds of these organizations. And so the question is no longer where do we start, how do we transition, but which organization do we join?
Yeah, the transition movement is a really positive one. And interestingly, the Transition Town movement emerged directly out of permaculture, because one of the projects of the course, Rob Hopkins was running a permaculture course in Ireland, and the project he set for his students was to look more broadly at how permaculture could be applied to changing the way that their town was in terms of getting ecological features, getting ecological livelihoods, and really thinking more broadly. And so they came up with this plan, this transition plan. Mm-hmm. And so from that point, the transition movement sort of emerged out of permaculture and went into that broader thinking, but very much has its roots in that. And I had a recent conversation with Rob about permaculture and transition town. Yeah.
You know, I have many connections with permaculture. Many of my students in the Capra course are, practitioners of permaculture, and one is an editor of magazine, Permaculture Magazine. And what I noticed from my conversations with them is that the term permaculture has evolved over time from the meaning of culture in agriculture to the meaning of culture in a more general way. This is very interesting. And of course, you with your new Permayouth movement are sort of the latest branch in this evolution. I find this really interesting. It's a very creative field, that field of permaculture.
So I have read that you have said the human observer constitute the final link in the chain of observational processes, and the properties of any atomic object can be understood only in terms of the object's interaction with the observer. From a permaculture viewpoint, principle 1 is observe and interact. Do you see this as one of the same?
Yeah, I must say this is an amazing question from a 12-year-old. I'm really impressed.
I surround myself with wonderful young people, I have to say.
And it's a really interesting question. And the answer is that it's not the same. There's a difference. And this difference leads us right into the heart of quantum theory. When you look at a field, a permaculture field, or anything else, the process of observation does not influence what you are observing. So the field is just there and the plants grow and you observe them growing and then you interact. So first you observe and then to interact. Well, when you observe an atom, it's very different. Because an atom, of course, is so small that you can't see it. So imagine our whole planet Earth tightly packed with cherries. That's the magnified image of the orange. Atoms, there's no way we can see them. So in order, how do we observe them? Well, to shine light on an atom means to bombard it with photons, which are the particles of light, which changes the structure of the atom. So the very act of observation is always already an interaction.
The concept of regenerative gardening has evolved from a combination of sustainable/regenerative agriculture and agroecology, agroforestry, and sustainable gardening, using permaculture ethics and some people say that the place to be in gardening is no longer just in sustainability, it's being regenerative. Do you feel that this is a true statement, and do you have any thoughts on the benefits of regenerative gardening on farms?
Yeah, again, this is a fantastic question and a very important one. And I have the same experience here in California. People more and more says, sustainability, that's such an outdated word, and what we really need is regenerative agriculture and the regenerative economics and so on. Now, I must tell you that I really like the term regenerative because it's very evocative. It is immediately understandable, whereas sustainability is not immediately understandable. But to say that, as some people do, that to talk about sustainable agriculture is really wrong. We should talk about regenerative agriculture. That's sort of an erroneous perception that sustainability means to sustain what we have, to sustain the status quo. And if you understand life from a systems point of view, you can easily see that regeneration is an essential property of life. But what I do when I talk about sustainability, I now you both, and I say, we need a sustainable regenerative agriculture, or, a sustainable regenerative economics, or healthcare system, and so on. So I use both terms because I really like the term regenerative. But this does not deny the nature of sustainability.
I think that's a really great response, because it has created a little bit of, I feel, friction somewhere in the conversations that happen, and it really, at this point, we can't be having that kind of conversation which diminishes what we're doing. We really need the conversation that brings all of that work together so that we can move forward with more strength and to help get the political will behind the movement.
How can we shift from rational linear thinking to ecological non-linear thinking?
Well, there are, speaking as a scientist and mathematician, there's a nonlinear mathematics. There are many kind of nonlinearity. But what we mean, and what I understand that you mean in your question, is the kind of nonlinear thinking that is thinking in terms of networks, because this is the main shift in the emergence of the new paradigm, the shift from the machine to the network. So, for example, why is organically grown food more expensive than industrially grown food? If you go to a supermarket, you will see, at least here in California, there are sections of organically grown food. Unfortunately, they get larger and larger and in more and more markets, but they are more expensive than the industrially grown food. Now, it doesn't really make sense, because organically grown food has fewer energy inputs and has fewer chemical inputs. There's actually no chemical inputs. And it is locally grown, so fewer transportation costs. So it should be cheaper, not more expensive. So this is how you train yourself. You practice systemic thinking by always asking, how are things connected to other things? And, what's behind it all? It's not easy to do, but it's something that I have done for a very long time. Another technique is to draw conceptual maps, which are also called mind maps, where you put concepts and ideas on a piece of paper and then interconnect them with lines. That's a very good technique also to practice this nonlinear thinking, but it's not easy.
We've been practicing lately too with warm data conversations. So using Nora Bateson's kind of approach.
Oh, great.
That's been really, getting that sort of trans-contextual understanding of ideas. So we've been using that as a way to have conversations with teens around the world, which has been a really
great
fun process too. So thanks, Fritjof. I'm wondering.
Let me ask you something, both Maya and Eve. You belong to a generation who has grown up with social media. I don't know how old you were when you first used them, but you live in this world of social networks. I mean, you are very aware of being connected to networks in your everyday lives. Every time you pick up your phone, I don't know how much you use your phone, but every time you pick it up, you're connected to a network. Now, it would seem that you would find it easier to think in terms of networks because of this experience. And I wonder whether that's true. I mean, it's probably difficult for you to compare your thinking to that of others who haven't grown up in networks like myself. But can you say anything about that? Or Morag, can you anything about saying about, interacting with this young generation and communicating with them?
I'll let Maya and Eve answer first, and then maybe I can respond as well.
I don't really use social media that much, but from what I do, it's actually, I think for me it's less network, because it's very one-dimensional. Like you can't see their faces, and it's just the words on a page usually for like messaging apps and stuff. Social media, like, it's very hard to tell what people mean as well, because there's no gestures, there's no eye contact, you can't see their face.
I see.
How about you, Eve? Do you use social media at all?
I do quite a lot, because I use Skype to connect with friends who don't live in my vicinity. But I get, like, when you just message, you're not so much connected to them, because you can't see their body language and what they're meaning, because you could easily misunderstand what they mean by their words.
That's very interesting. So it is a network. The social media then is a network that extends farther than your personal face-to-face network of people, but it's impoverished at the same time. That's what you're telling us.
So, but the thing where we are finding a level of richness, and never quite the same as being face-to-face, is through using this Zoom. And the Permayouth connects via Zoom. And like I was saying before, we have people from Zanzibar and Sweden, Thailand, Philippines, the UK, Germany, even the Permayouth kids from refugee camps in Uganda join in sometimes as well. And so we have this much broader sense of, I guess, our place in the world and our reach and our capacity to change and to learn and our friendships, our understanding of different cultures and languages and needs and what's happening in the world. For example, having a deeper context, deeper understanding of the context of the refugees, for example, and that, we just learned the other week that their rations have been cut by half. And so we're now supporting them directly through helping them to access materials to do urgent kitchen gardens. And so these relationships form by having these networks over social media, but particularly when there's more texture to it, like this visual, like we can create more of a relationship when we have more of that warm data.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think we're just talking about how we belong online and stuff. That kind of related to my question about what does it mean to belong?
Yes, I think in my view, to belong means to be a member of a community. Now, in our daily lives, we all belong to several communities, maybe to many communities, but all of us share two communities to which we belong, two large communities. We're all members of humanity, and we belong to the biosphere, the community of life. And as such, we should behave in a certain way that shows that we belong to these communities. To belong to humanity means that we should respect human rights and human dignity. And to belong to the biosphere, to the community of life, means that we should respect ecological sustainability. And in both cases, the behavior is behavior for the common good, which is what is also known as ethical behavior.
One of the things I just wanted to mention about that too, that we, in the Permayouth, we have quite a lot of conversations around ethics, because the core part of permaculture is this set of three ethics, which is earth care, people care, and fair share. And so what that's, obviously earth care, caring for
Yeah.
the planetary systems, caring for the the biosphere, people care, caring for ourselves, for family, for others. And fair share is really looking at that question of, well, how can we live within a certain means so that, or diminish the footprint that we have so that it leaves enough space and resources for other people, for other cultures, other communities, and also the community of life.
Yeah.
And so these three ethics are the foundation of then these set of principles of design, which are based on the principles of ecology, and then applying that into how we design human systems flow through that.
Well, this is really interesting to me because I just said a minute ago that the two communities to which we belong imply a respect of human dignity, human rights, and sustainability. And you can associate sustainability with earth care and human dignity, with people care and human rights, with fair share.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fits beautifully.
Yeah.
Abundance is one of my favorite words. From my 12-year-old point of view, I see that the major problems of our time is climate change, food security, replenishing soils to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, and producing enough energy. I see these problems as interconnected. In our permaculture garden at home, with my family, we are trying to tackle all these problems systemically, independently as a whole. Do you think we, I say we as global citizens, can tackle these problems using interconnectivity on a large scale?
Yes, well, I totally agree with you what you say about the interconnectedness of the problem. That's what I mentioned before in the beginning, that the major problems of our time are systemic problems, which means that they're all interconnected and interdependent. And, the important thing to realize is they cannot be solved in isolation, which means that systemic problems require corresponding systemic solutions, meaning solutions that look at every problem in terms of how it's connected to other problems, that solve a particular problem within the context of other problems. And this means that typically systemic solutions solve several problems at the same time. And, I come to the conclusion that today we have the knowledge, the technologies, and the financial means to move toward a sustainable future. What we need is political will and leadership. That's all we need.
And there was a quote from your book. I think it was from the very early pages of your textbook that you're saying that there are solutions to the major problems of our time, and some even simple. I think, it's actually to not overcomplicate things, but actually to see where there's some very simple, straightforward solutions that we already have, and that you go on to say, but they require a radical shift in our perceptions, our thinking, and our values. And then that leads into really that, I guess that then shapes our will, doesn't it? If we perceive our relationship differently, if we understand, we have a different set of values, we make different decisions, and we lead from a different position.
Yeah. Yes, and if we realize and really experience that we are connected to the entire community of life, then we also realize what we do to the community of life, we do to ourselves. And therefore, just from a value of self-preservation and growth and development, we would take care or be responsible in our actions toward the community of life.
How important is shifting cultural norms and expectations with how we interact with the world? And how can we amplify these changes that are happening to meet the scale of the crisis? And also, is this the right question to be asking?
Yes, absolutely. This is a very important question. And, we have talked about community, we have talked about networks, we have talked about interconnecting networks as you do in the Permayouth movement. And I think that's the answer. That's what we have to do. We have to educate ourselves, we have to educate others, and we have to interconnect our networks.
With all of nature's complexities and abundance, do you think we as a whole will work with nature and come together to respect what nature can teach us?
Well, I think it should be clear now from our conversation that working with nature is our only chance. If we want to survive as a human civilization, we have to change our ways, dramatically and work with nature rather than, trying to dominate her and control her. And I want to mention something to you, which I don't know whether you know. I subscribe to an online journal which is called The Optimist Daily. Have you heard about that?
No, I think we'll subscribe to that. Yeah.
So Google The Optimist Daily, and as the name says, it comes out daily, and it has daily good news of sustainable solutions. It's really a fabulous. The examples I mentioned were taken from this magazine. I read it every day, and then I take excerpts, and it's really a fantastic magazine.
Wonderful. Thank you for that link. We were just talking the other day about how we need to have more good news stories, and that's what we need.
So we have a society that doesn't particularly like death, but how do we embrace it in an ecological systems approach?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. I think I have a really interesting answer for you. So when you and I relate it to what we talked about when we talked about regeneration. So remember that the very essence of life is to regenerate itself. But for the individual cells, if we move to the level of cells, that regeneration is a cycle of life and death. Right? So the cells die continually and are reborn continually, so that at a higher level, the organism continues to live. The fact that we all are born and live and get old and die is regenerative for society, for humanity as a whole, and ultimately for the community of life. So that's the positive view of life and death.
How can we help balance the yin and yang?
Yeah, that also that is a question. Actually, I loved it, and when you sent this to me, I didn't know what to say initially. I had to meditate it a little bit, but then I came up with something which is really a new idea that I haven't had before, and I'm very grateful to you for asking the question, because it led me to something new. So, in my understanding of these Chinese terms, which are very important in Chinese philosophy, the yang describes qualities of expansion, of competition, of extraction, and as an umbrella term, you can call them qualities of self-assertion. So in order to practice our integrative qualities, we can do that by enhancing the importance of community. Right. So thank you again for the question. That was a great question.
What do you think we need to change to be able to tackle the major problems of our time?
Well, I think we really have talked about that. This is really sort of a summary question. I think we need to change our thinking and to change our values. But fortunately, we have a magnificent document that has done that, lay out the values of, respect of human dignity, human rights, ecological sustainability, and that's the Earth Charter. I don't know whether you are familiar with the Earth Charter, but it's a fantastic document that was created about 20 years ago in a very unique process of global collaboration of many organizations, individuals, and communities. And the Earth Charter is a declaration of 16 ethical principles and values to create a world that is sustainable, just, and peaceful. That's how they describe it. And I recommend it very highly. And this would be a very good working document for you guys for, exploring ethics and values.
Fantastic. We will do that. That's great. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out. We've been exploring each of the ethics and the principles of permaculture. We've just finished that. So it's a perfect time to start exploring the Earth Charter now. I wanted to ask you then another set of goals, I suppose, is that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's come more recently. Do you feel that that's a really useful tool I was talking to May East, who I believe was one of the authors of it. She was, Maya and I met her recently from Gaia Education, and she was saying that she sees the SDGs as a kind of a framework, and that permaculture, she's seen around the world that it's often kind of the pathway to implement the SDGs. And I'm just wondering where does the SDGs sit in your thinking of a way of it?
Well, I have thought about them. I thought about them quite a lot last year because I got an invitation from the United Nations to produce a video about the SDGs and about the importance of systems thinking. And the video is called The Heart of the Matter. And so it has been seen by thousands of people. And I'm actually somewhat surprised that you haven't seen it yet.
I had seen it, but I was, it just popped out of my mind connecting it to this question.
So my main point is that since, as I said before, since the major problems of the world are all interconnected, the solutions need to be interconnected too. Therefore, the SDGs need to be interconnected. And they are conceptually, but practically they are not. So the SDGs have their problems, but it's a good effort and they can be, worked on.
Yes, I know that one always stands out to me as this glaring mismatch amongst the rest. That's right. Yeah. So we will also share that video with the rest of the Permayouth. I think Eve and Maya, that would be a really great focal point for discussion. Yeah. Fantastic.
Maybe you can create a new set of Perma SDGs,
That's a great idea. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking if there's any final questions, maybe. We've been talking for 1 hour 40, and I so appreciate your time.
Time flies when you're in good company.
Oh my gosh, it has, hasn't it?
How can we learn from intuitive wisdom of ancient traditions?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning that, in my life as a physicist, I noticed very striking parallels between modern physics and ancient Eastern wisdom. And then I investigated those and wrote a book about them. And so I think this is very fertile ground. Systemic thinking is not limited to science or to, people in the networks we have talked about. But many indigenous traditions embody a vision of the world in terms of relationships, in terms of networks. There is a very famous phrase of Native American thinking, which talks about nature in terms of all my relations. And when you look at that from a science point of view, you can take this literally, because as Darwin has shown us, we all derive from a common living ancestor. And so when we say that the plants and animals in our environment are our cousins, that is literally true. Maybe you in Australia with the Permayouth movement, you can do some pioneering work here because you have a very rich Aboriginal traditions in Australia. And so the question is, are you in contact with them or do you plan to be in contact with them? I'm actually very curious about that.
I've just met. We have an elder here who came to our first camp and talked about Indigenous culture, Wurrunga, and I've just met and connected with an amazing cultural ecologist, an Indigenous woman from south of here who she has a Ph.D. in Indigenous seasons and plants and Indigenous agriculture. And so just trying to work out a time to connecting with her. So very much thinking about how we can connect with the local Indigenous culture.
Well, you know, I have worked a lot in education, and Morag knows that I'm the co-founder of an organization called Center for Ecological Literacy, promoting the idea of ecological literacy, of knowing about ecology, the principles of ecology. And we have worked very closely for many years with an Indigenous so-called wisdom teacher, a Canadian woman called Jeanette Armstrong, who is an Okanagan member of the Okanagan Nation in British Columbia. And so we have worked a lot with her in developing teaching methods for the Center for Ecoliteracy. So this has been a very fruitful collaboration. So I would encourage you to go in this direction.
Yes, it feels I think what we're doing at the moment with Permayouth is making connections, building the relationships, and just seeing what kind of emerges through those generative conversations and following curiosities and opening up to new things. And it's a really quite wonderful process and experience to be involved in. Well, thank you so very much, Fritjof, for taking the time to answer these questions and to explore new ideas and open up the Permayouth into the world of systems thinking and really ground it in something that feels, I don't know, really significant. So
Great.
this
Well, thank you, Morag. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Maya and Eve, for your fabulous questions. They were really inspiring, and I hope I helped you to learn something. I certainly did. And let's do it again sometime. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Fritjof.